The rain in Seattle doesn't fall. It hangs in the air like an accusation. And that particular Tuesday night in October, I could feel every single drop of moisture seeping through the walls of our $3 million smart home as I lay in bed at 1:15 in the morning, staring at the ceiling like it owed me answers. My name is Ryan Coldwell. I served 12 years as a Marine before transitioning into corporate cybersecurity. And I can tell you right now that the silence between a husband and wife at 1 in the morning hits different than any combat zone I've ever been deployed to. Emily's back was turned to me, the same way it had been turned to me for exactly 123 nights in a row. Not that I was counting, except I was absolutely counting, because that's what my brain does when something doesn't add up. The funny thing about being married to someone for 9 years is that you learn their breathing patterns better than you learn your own. And I could tell she wasn't asleep because her shoulders were too tense, and there was that familiar blue glow of her phone screen reflecting off the silk pillowcase she'd insisted we needed because cotton was apparently too pedestrian for her newly refined tastes. She was texting someone at 1 in the morning while pretending to be exhausted from work, and the old Ryan, the Ryan from 6 months ago, would have reached over and asked her what was wrong, maybe tried to pull her close and remind her that we used to fall asleep, tangled up in each other like we couldn't bear to let go. But I wasn't that Ryan anymore. I cleared my throat softly, just enough to let her know I was awake, and called out to her in that careful voice husbands use when they're walking on eggshells in their own homes. She didn't even flinch, didn't even pretend to be startled, just let out this heavy sigh that sounded like I was asking her to move mountains instead of just acknowledging my existence. "I have an early meeting tomorrow, Ryan, please," she said, and her voice had this quality to it that I can only describe as the sound of a door slamming in your face without anyone actually touching the door. Cold, dismissive, irritated, like my presence in our bed was an inconvenience she was barely tolerating. 4 months of this, and I'm not talking about the normal ebb and flow of married life, where sometimes you're tired and sometimes the spark needs rekindling. I'm talking about 4 months of my wife treating physical contact with me like I was carrying some kind of infectious disease. 4 months of excuses that got thinner and thinner until they were practically transparent. 4 months of watching the woman I'd built a life with slowly transform into a stranger who happened to share my last name and my address. The bed that used to be our sanctuary had become a DMZ, and she'd made it crystal clear which side of the line I was supposed to stay on. I got up without saying another word because what was there to say at this point, and walked to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the smart lighting system that I'd installed myself because I'm an engineer, and that's what engineers do. We fix things and make them work better, except apparently I couldn't fix whatever had broken between me and my wife. The calendar on the refrigerator caught my eye, and I felt something twist in my chest when I realized that tomorrow, or technically today, since it was past midnight, was the anniversary of our first date. 9 years ago, I'd taken her to this little Italian place in the U District, the kind with red checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles. And she'd laughed at everything I said and looked at me like I was the most interesting person she'd ever met. The date wasn't circled on the calendar, which meant either she'd forgotten or she didn't care, and I wasn't sure which option was worse. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in the dark kitchen, nursing my water and listening to the rain and letting my mind do what it does best, which is analyze patterns and identify anomalies. Because here's the thing about being trained in cybersecurity. You start to see the world as a series of systems, and when something in a system starts behaving differently than it should, that's called an indicator of compromise. And my marriage, my life, my entire domestic situation was throwing up more red flags than a communist parade. Morning came with that gray Seattle light that makes everything look like it's been photographed through a dirty window, and I watched Emily get ready for work with the same detached attention I'd give to surveillance footage. She spent 45 minutes choosing an outfit, which was 20 minutes longer than usual, and she was humming to herself, actually humming like someone who had something to look forward to, except that something clearly wasn't me or our forgotten anniversary. Her phone buzzed on the marble countertop, and she practically lunged for it, her whole body language changing from casual to alert in a way that told me everything I needed to know about who was on the other end of that message. Client from the Tokyo office? I asked, keeping my voice deliberately neutral as I sipped my coffee. Must be tough with the time difference. She looked up at me with those green eyes that I used to think were beautiful, and now just looked calculating. And she smiled that professional smile that didn't reach anywhere near her actual face. You know how it is. Global business never sleeps. What I knew was that North Peak Energy had closed their Tokyo office 6 weeks ago due to restructuring, and what I also knew was that my wife had just lied to my face without even blinking. And what I knew most of all was that the woman standing in front of me in her designer dress and her expensive heels wasn't the same woman I'd married. She'd become someone else, someone who looked at me like I was furniture, someone who lied about phone calls and worked late hours and came home smelling like perfume that wasn't hers and restaurant food that I'd never tasted. After she left for work in her BMW that she'd insisted we needed because her old Lexus was apparently too embarrassing to park in the North Peak garage, I sat down at my home office computer and started doing what I do best. I'm the head of cybersecurity at North Peak Energy, which means I have access to things that most people don't even know exist. And more importantly, I have the skills to find things that people think they've hidden. Some husbands in my situation would have confronted their wives, would have screamed and thrown things and demanded explanations. But I wasn't some husbands. I was a former Marine who'd spent 12 years learning that the first rule of any operation is intelligence gathering, and you never, ever show your hand until you're ready to make your move. The first thing I did was check the GPS data from Emily's company phone, which I had perfectly legitimate access to as the security administrator, and what I found was interesting. According to the official records, her phone spent most of its time either at the office or at our home, exactly where you'd expect a dedicated marketing director's phone to be. But phones are chatty little devices, and they leave traces in places that most people don't think to look. And when I dug deeper into the network logs, I found that her phone had been pinging off cell towers in the Bellevue area with suspicious regularity, specifically towers near a boutique hotel called the Silver Bay that was popular with executives who needed discretion more than they needed a corporate rate. 40 extra miles a week on her car's odometer that she couldn't explain, trips to a hotel that had nothing to do with her marketing campaigns, and restaurant receipts for places that served oysters and champagne, which was interesting because Emily had always told me she hated oysters, said they reminded her of snot, except apparently she'd developed a taste for them recently, or more likely, someone else had been ordering for her. The pieces started falling into place with the cold precision of a puzzle that you didn't want to solve but couldn't stop yourself from completing. Her sudden interest in the gym, the new perfume that smelled like something you'd find in a five-star hotel bathroom, the way she'd started calling me by my full name instead of the nickname she'd used for years, the upgraded wardrobe, the late nights, the business trips that didn't quite match up with her calendar. Every single detail was another data point in an equation that I desperately didn't want to solve, but was solving anyway, because that's what I do. I find the truth even when the truth is going to tear my guts out. That night at work, I stayed late in the server room, which wasn't unusual because I often stayed late and nobody questioned it. The hum of the servers was almost meditative, like white noise for a mind that was anything but quiet. And I sat in the blue glow of multiple monitors as I pulled up the communication logs for North Peak's corporate phones. As the head of security, I had access to metadata for emergency and compliance purposes, and what I found in those logs made my blood run cold in a way that even combat hadn't managed to do. Emily's contact-marked HR department had been getting a lot of attention lately, which would have been completely normal if the number associated with that contact had actually belonged to HR instead of belonging to Nathaniel Blake, our chief financial officer and the kind of corporate shark who wore his success like a weapon. Nate Blake was the guy everyone loved to hate, the one who laughed too loud at his own jokes and wore watches that cost more than most people's cars and had a way of making everyone in the room feel like they were auditioning for his approval. He was also married with 3 kids and a wife who did charity work and smiled for photographs at company events like she hadn't quite figured out what she'd signed up for. I pulled up their message history, and as I read through months of texts, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the surface. The messages started professional enough, discussions about marketing budgets and quarterly projections, but they evolved with depressing predictability into something else entirely. Inside jokes and late-night conversations, and messages that made it clear they weren't just discussing spreadsheets during their frequent working dinners. The one that hit me hardest was from 3 weeks ago, when my wife, the woman I'd pledged my life to, had written to her lover that, "The old fool Moore won't notice a thing. We can push through another 50,000 by the end of the quarter." Followed by his response asking about the soldier boy at home, and her reply that I was harmless, a nobody who'll be out of my life as soon as the bonuses hit. Harmless, she'd called me, a nobody, and there it was in black and white, the truth about how the woman I'd loved for nearly a decade actually saw me. Not as a partner, not as a husband, not even as an obstacle worth respecting, just a placeholder, a warm body to come home to while she built her real life with someone else. I sat in that server room for a long time, just breathing, just letting the information settle into my brain and rearrange itself into something I could work with. The old me, the younger me, the me from before I'd learned that emotions in combat get people killed. That version of Ryan Coldwell might have driven home and confronted his wife, might have screamed and broken things and demanded answers that wouldn't change anything anyway. But I wasn't that person anymore, and I understood with perfect clarity that the woman I'd married was already gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end, and that the only question left was how I was going to handle what came next. Because here's what Emily and her boyfriend didn't understand about me, and what most people in my life didn't understand either. The calm, quiet, steady guy who showed up to work every day and did his job without drama, the husband who didn't make scenes and accepted his wife's excuses without pushing back. That wasn't weakness. That was discipline. The same discipline that had kept me alive in situations that would have broken other people. The same discipline that let me function in environments where losing your cool meant losing your life. And now that discipline was going to be put to a different kind of use, because I wasn't going to lose my cool, wasn't going to give Emily or Nate the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. I was going to wait and watch and gather every piece of evidence I could find. And when the time was right, I was going to dismantle their carefully constructed world with the same methodical precision I'd used to take down a hostile network. The weeks that followed were an exercise in controlled deception. Me playing the role of the oblivious husband while internally cataloging every lie, every inconsistency, every piece of data that told the real story. I brought Emily flowers for our anniversary, watched her fake smile and make excuses about being too tired to celebrate, noted the way she checked her phone approximately 30 seconds after walking away from me. I told her I understood, that work was stressful, that we celebrate when things calm down, and I saw something like relief in her eyes that confirmed what I already knew, that she'd stopped thinking of me as a threat long ago, if she'd ever thought of me that way at all. There was one particular dinner during that period that stands out in my memory with painful clarity. The kind of evening that should have been normal, but instead felt like watching a play where everyone had forgotten their lines except me. Emily had come home late again, claiming a marathon meeting with the European team, and I'd made pasta from scratch because cooking was one of the ways I'd always shown love, and old habits die hard. She barely looked at the meal when she sat down, more interested in her phone than the hours I'd spent preparing something she used to request specifically. "This is nice," she said without any conviction whatsoever, pushing the linguine around her plate like a child hiding vegetables. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble." "It's not trouble when it's for someone you care about," I replied, watching her face for any flicker of guilt or recognition, and finding nothing but impatience poorly disguised as tiredness. She left most of the food untouched and excused herself to take a conference call that lasted 2 hours and produced a lot of muffled laughter from behind the closed door of our home office. I cleaned up the kitchen alone, put the leftovers in containers she would never eat, and sat at the counter wondering when exactly my marriage had become a performance I was required to attend but never actually invited to participate in. The next morning I found a receipt in her coat pocket that she'd meant to throw away. Dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never heard of, the bill splitting champagne and oysters, and dessert in amounts that suggested celebration rather than business. The date on the receipt was our anniversary, the same night she'd told me she was too exhausted to do anything but sleep. She hadn't just forgotten our anniversary, she'd actively chosen to spend it with someone else while I sat at home watching the hours tick by and telling myself that work really was just that demanding sometimes. Meanwhile, I dug deeper into the financial records, following the money trail that Emily and Nate had been so careless about hiding. They'd set up a shell company, a marketing consultancy that existed only on paper, and they'd been funneling inflated invoices through North Peak's advertising budget for the past 18 months. The amounts weren't astronomical by corporate standards, but they added up $2.5 million skimmed through fake campaigns and ghost vendors and creative accounting that would have made an auditor weep. And the beautiful part, the part that almost made me laugh out loud in my dark server room, was that they'd done it all using company systems, leaving digital fingerprints everywhere like a couple of amateurs who thought they were criminal masterminds. But it got worse, because of course it got worse. As I followed the trail, I discovered that Emily hadn't just been stealing money and sleeping with her boss. She'd been actively sabotaging other people's careers to clear her path to the top. Internal emails showed her sharing confidential information about other VP candidates with Nate, giving him ammunition to torpedo their projects and make them look incompetent in front of Harold Moore, the company's founder and CEO. Good people, people who'd worked hard and played by the rules, had their careers derailed because my wife wanted a corner office and was willing to burn anyone who got in her way. Harold Moore was old money and old school, the kind of self-made billionaire who'd built North Peak from a single gas station in Montana to a regional energy empire through sheer grit and an almost religious devotion to integrity. He was the kind of man who still answered his own phone sometimes and remembered the names of employees he'd met once at a company picnic 3 years ago. He was also the kind of man who took betrayal personally, very personally, and when I started compiling my evidence, I knew exactly who needed to see it. The meeting with Harold happened on a Thursday afternoon, in his corner office on the 40th floor, where you could see all of Seattle spread out below like a map of everything he'd built. I walked in with a black folder containing printouts of every email, every transaction, every piece of evidence I'd collected, and I placed it on his desk without ceremony or preamble, because Harold was the kind of man who appreciated directness. "What's this, Coldwell?" he asked without looking up from his computer screen. "You requesting time off or something?" "No, sir," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "This is an internal security audit concerning potential financial irregularities. Approximately $2.5 million in fraudulent transactions over the past 18 months. That got his attention, and he slowly closed his laptop and looked at me with those gray eyes that had made countless business opponents squirm in their seats. Harold Moore at 63 looked like he could still go a few rounds in a bar fight, and there was a reason nobody in the company crossed him twice. "Go on," he said. I laid it out for him the way I would have briefed a commanding officer, clean and factual and supported by evidence at every point. The shell company, the inflated invoices, the paper trail that led directly to Nathaniel Blake's personal accounts, and from there to a shared fund that Emily had access to. I showed him the emails where they'd discussed their scheme, casual as anything, like they were planning a vacation instead of committing corporate fraud. I showed him the communications that proved they'd been deliberately undermining other executives to advance Emily's career. And yes, I showed him the hotel footage, not because I wanted his sympathy, but because it established the nature of their relationship and the depth of their collaboration in a way that the financial evidence alone couldn't convey. I'd accessed that footage through legitimate security channels, the kind of thing that was technically within my purview as head of cybersecurity, even if I wouldn't normally have had a reason to look for it. Harold went through the folder page by page, his face getting stonier with each piece of evidence. And when he finally looked up at me, there was something in his expression that I recognized from my time in the service. The look of a man who'd been personally insulted and was calculating exactly how to respond. "Your wife," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Still legally anyway. I imagine that'll be changing soon." He studied me for a long moment, and I knew what he was looking for. Some sign of emotional weakness, some indication that this was a spurned husband's revenge rather than a legitimate security concern. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded once, sharply, like he was confirming something to himself. They played this all wrong, son. Went after a man who knows how to fight without making a scene. He closed the folder and placed his hand on top of it, like he was making a promise. The charity gala is Friday. We're going to make an example that nobody in this industry will forget. The next 24 hours were a strange kind of limbo, me going through the motions of my life while knowing that everything was about to change. I went home and had dinner with Emily, listening to her talk about her day, while knowing that every word out of her mouth was either a lie or a misdirection. She mentioned the gala, said Nate had hinted that there might be a big announcement, and she actually seemed excited about it, practically glowing with anticipation of her own coronation. "You'll try to look presentable, won't you?" she said, adjusting my collar with fingers that felt like they belonged to a stranger. "This is important for my career." "Wouldn't dream of embarrassing you," I said, and I meant it in ways she couldn't possibly understand. Friday arrived with that kind of crystalline autumn weather that Seattle sometimes produces as an apology for all the rain, and Emily spent the entire day getting ready like she was preparing for her own wedding. Hair salon, nail salon, makeup artist, the whole production. And when she finally emerged in a $3,000 dress that she'd bought with money stolen from the company she pretended to serve, she looked like a magazine cover and about as warm. I watched her preen in front of the mirror for 20 minutes straight, adjusting angles and examining herself from every possible direction, like she was memorizing what perfection looked like. Her vanity had always been there, I suppose, but it used to be tempered by warmth, by moments where she would catch me watching her and laugh at her own ridiculousness. Now there was no laughter, just cold assessment, like she was evaluating a product for market readiness. "The emerald earrings or the diamonds?" she asked, holding one against each ear without actually looking at me for an opinion. "The emeralds bring out your eyes," I said automatically. The kind of response I'd given 1,000 times during our marriage, and I watched her ignore my input completely and choose the diamonds anyway. "The diamonds are worth more," she explained to her own reflection, as if that was the only metric that mattered, which I suppose for her it probably was. We drove separately to the gala venue because Emily claimed she might need to stay late for networking, and I shouldn't feel obligated to wait. The real reason, of course, was that she wanted the flexibility to leave with Nate without having to explain herself. But I accepted her excuse with the same passive agreement I'd been practicing for months. Let her think I was the oblivious husband she'd convinced herself she'd married. Let her believe until the very last moment that she was the smartest person in every room. The limo ride to the Grand Aurora Hotel was an exercise in studied indifference. Emily texting with Nate the entire time while I watched the city lights slide past my window and thought about nothing at all. She didn't notice my silence, or if she did, she didn't care enough to ask about it, and that suited me just fine. The man sitting next to her wasn't the husband she'd dismissed and betrayed. He was something else entirely now, something she'd helped create with her lies and her schemes, and her conviction that I was too stupid and too weak to ever be a threat. I caught our reflection in the tinted window. Two people in formal wear sitting close enough to touch, but separated by a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. And I thought about all the times I'd sat in vehicles heading toward situations where the outcome was uncertain and possibly fatal. This felt different, but also strangely similar. That sense of calm before a storm you know is coming and have prepared for as thoroughly as possible. The ballroom of the Grand Aurora was everything you'd expect from a high-end corporate charity event. All crystal chandeliers and ice sculptures, and waiters circulating with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than some people made in a week. The room was packed with investors and board members and executives who all seemed to know each other and speak in that particular language of people who've never had to worry about paying their rent. Emily transformed the moment we walked through those doors, becoming the perfect corporate wife, charming and poised and utterly in her element among the sharks. I spotted Nate across the room immediately, standing near the stage with that predatory smile he always wore, looking every inch the successful executive in his custom suit and his $7,000 watch. He caught Emily's eye and gave her a subtle nod that probably looked innocent to anyone who wasn't watching for it, and she responded with a slight adjustment of her hair that might as well have been a secret handshake. These two idiots thought they were being so clever, so subtle, when anyone with half a brain and a reason to look could see exactly what was going on between them. I spent the cocktail hour making polite conversation with mid-level managers who seemed vaguely surprised that the cybersecurity director could form complete sentences about topics other than firewalls and encryption protocols. One of them, a woman from accounting named Linda, who had always struck me as sharper than her job title suggested, asked about Emily with the kind of careful neutrality that told me she probably knew more than she was saying. "Your wife seems to be doing well," Linda observed, watching Emily work the room like a politician running for office. "She's certainly made an impression on the executive team." "She has a gift for making impression," I agreed, keeping my voice absolutely neutral, and Linda gave me a look that suggested she understood exactly what I wasn't saying. The dinner portion was an elaborate affair with multiple courses and the kind of wine pairings that only people with expense accounts actually order, and I found myself seated at a table with board members who spent most of the meal discussing golf handicaps and real estate investments in Maui. Emily was at a different table, closer to the stage, flanked by Nate and two other executives who hung on her every word like she was dispensing wisdom instead of charm offensive. She glanced at me once during the entire meal, a quick flick of the eyes that confirmed I was still in my assigned place, and then returned to the performance she was giving for her real audience. The evening proceeded with the usual tedium of corporate events, speeches about community involvement and charitable giving, and North Peak's commitment to excellence in all things. Emily worked the room like she was running for office, introducing herself to board members and laughing at terrible jokes, and positioning herself as close to the stage as possible without being too obvious about it. She barely acknowledged me the entire time, except to occasionally steer me away from conversations she considered too important for a mere cybersecurity engineer. Around 9 o'clock, Harold Moore took the stage, and the room fell into that respectful silence that powerful men command without trying. He looked distinguished in his tuxedo, every inch the successful patriarch, and when he smiled at the crowd, there was nothing in his expression to suggest that anything unusual was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily without amplification, "tonight we're here to talk about transparency and the future of our company. But I've always believed that you can't build a future without first confronting the truth." Emily elbowed me in the ribs, her face practically glowing with anticipation. "This is it," she whispered. "He's going to announce the restructuring." I didn't respond, just watched as Harold gestured to a technician near the AV equipment, and the massive screen behind him flickered to life. I felt Emily tense beside me, expecting to see her own face, maybe her name in bold letters, announcing her promotion to a position she'd stolen and schemed for. What appeared instead was a text conversation. Emily's face went white so fast I thought she might actually faint, and across the room, I could see Nate Blake freeze mid-smile as his own words appeared on a screen the size of a small car, projected for 400 of the most important people in Seattle's business community to see. "That old fool Moore won't notice a thing. We can push through another 50,000 by the end of the quarter. What about the soldier boy at home? Ryan? He's harmless. A nobody who will be out of my life as soon as the bonus is hit." The silence in that ballroom was so complete, you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. And then Harold's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "These messages," he said, his tone almost conversational, "were exchanged between my chief financial officer and my director of marketing over the past several months, as part of a scheme that defrauded this company of over $2 million and destroyed the careers of several talented executives whose only crime was being in the way." The screen changed to financial documents, transaction records, the whole paper trail laid out in damning detail. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like the first tremors before an earthquake, and someone dropped a champagne glass that shattered on the marble floor with a sound like a starting pistol. Then the video appeared, surveillance footage from the Silver Bay Hotel, Emily and Nate walking through the lobby together with his hand low on her back, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, disappearing into an elevator that clearly wasn't taking them to separate rooms. The footage was tasteful enough that it wouldn't end up on the news, but explicit enough in its implications that nobody in that room could pretend not to understand what they were seeing. Nate made a break for the door, But two security guards materialized in his path like they'd been waiting for exactly this moment, which of course they had, because I'd personally briefed them before the event. His face had gone from predatory confidence to pale terror in about 3 seconds flat, and watching him realize that his carefully constructed world was crumbling in real time was almost enough to make up for the past 4 months of lying awake in an empty bed. Emily grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises, her voice a desperate hiss that was probably supposed to be quiet, but carried in the silent room anyway. "Ryan, do something. This is a mistake. These are fakes. It's some kind of setup." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw behind the perfect makeup and the designer dress to the person she'd become. The person who'd called me harmless and a nobody, who'd lied to my face every day for months, who'd stolen and schemed and destroyed without a second thought. And I felt nothing but a cold clarity that was almost peaceful. "I'm the head of cybersecurity, Emily," I said, making sure my voice carried to the people around us who were watching our little drama like it was dinner theater. "I verified these files personally. Every single one of them is authentic." I reached down and gently, deliberately removed her hand from my sleeve, like I was removing a piece of lint from an otherwise acceptable suit. The look on her face as she realized what was happening, as the implications of my involvement became clear, was something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the grim recognition that some moments cannot be undone. Harold's voice boomed through the speakers again, formal now and final. "Emily Coldwell and Nathaniel Blake are hereby terminated for cause, effective immediately. Their involvement in corporate fraud and ethics violations has been reported to the appropriate authorities, who are waiting in the lobby to continue this conversation." The camera flashes started then, a storm of light as every journalist in the room realized they'd just been handed the kind of story that made careers. Emily stood paralyzed in the center of it all, her carefully constructed image dissolving around her in real time. While across the room, Nate was being escorted out by security with the kind of firm grip that suggested resistance would not be advisable. She turned to me one last time, and I watched the emotions cascade across her face. Shock giving way to rage, giving way to something that might have been fear, as she finally understood that she'd underestimated me in ways that were going to cost her everything. "You did this," she said, and it wasn't a question. "You did this," I replied. "I just documented it." The crowd parted for me as I walked toward the exit, and I didn't look back. Behind me, I could hear Emily's voice rising in pitch as the police officers approached, making excuses and accusations that nobody was listening to, but it all faded into background noise as I stepped out into the cool Seattle night and took my first full breath in what felt like months. The next 48 hours were a hurricane of consequences that I watched from a deliberate distance, like observing a controlled demolition from behind safety glass. Nate's lawyer got him released on bail, but his first move was to throw Emily under the bus so comprehensively that their former alliance became a punchline in corporate circles for months afterward. According to his statement, he'd been seduced and manipulated, coerced into participating in a scheme masterminded by a woman who'd used her body to compromise his judgment, which was exactly the kind of pathetic deflection I'd expected from a man who'd never taken responsibility for anything in his life. The news coverage was relentless in that particularly modern way where every detail gets analyzed and reanalyzed until there's nothing left but opinions and hot takes. Someone leaked Emily's corporate headshot, and suddenly her face was everywhere. The ambitious executive who'd betrayed her company and her husband and apparently anyone else who got in her way. The comment sections were predictably savage, a mixture of moral outrage and schadenfreude that I couldn't bring myself to read more than once. Her former colleagues, the ones who'd smiled at her in meetings and laughed at her jokes and accepted her assistance with their projects, turned on her with the particular venom that people reserve for those who've been caught doing what everyone suspects but nobody can prove. The same executives who'd praised her work ethic and ambition were now claiming they'd always sensed something off about her, always knew she was too hungry, too calculating, too willing to do whatever it took. It was the kind of revisionist history that corporations specialize in, everyone distancing themselves from failure while taking credit for whatever success might have been achieved along the way. Emily's corporate credit cards were canceled before she even left the gala. Her accounts frozen as part of the fraud investigation. Her company car reported for immediate repossession. Her face was on the front page of every local news outlet by morning, and not in the way she'd always dreamed about. The ambitious executive who'd risked everything for a corner office was now the cautionary tale that HR departments would use to train new employees about ethics violations. I received calls from reporters looking for quotes, from lawyers looking for depositions, from former colleagues looking for gossip disguised as concern. I ignored most of them because this wasn't a story I wanted to tell or a narrative I needed to control. The facts spoke for themselves, documented in evidence files and court records, and the kind of corporate communications that would be studied in business ethics courses for years to come. She tried to come home that night, standing in the rain outside our front gate like something out of a movie. Except this wasn't a romantic comedy and there wasn't going to be a heartwarming reconciliation. The security code had been changed, a detail I'd handled earlier that day, along with consultation with a divorce attorney who specialized in protecting assets in cases of spousal fraud. Her belongings were packed in boxes that were already starting to soften in the Seattle drizzle. Designer clothes and expensive shoes and all the material evidence of a life she'd built on stolen money and broken trust. I watched her on the security camera for a while, watched her pound on the gate and then the door, watched her mascara run in black rivers down her cheeks as the rain transformed her from corporate predator to something smaller and more pathetic. There was a time when seeing her in distress would have broken my heart, when I would have rushed outside to comfort her regardless of what she'd done, but that time had passed somewhere between reading those text messages and watching her lie to my face day after day without a flicker of remorse. She stood there for almost an hour, alternating between pounding on surfaces and slumping against them, and I found myself wondering what she was thinking, whether she was genuinely sorry or just sorry she got caught. Whether somewhere in that calculating mind of hers there was a flicker of understanding about the difference between those two things. The rain kept falling, indifferent to her suffering, the way life tends to be indifferent to people who finally run out of second chances. And eventually she pulled out her phone, probably to call one of the friends who would quickly discover that being associated with her was suddenly bad for their own careers. When I finally opened the door, I didn't step outside. The rain was coming down harder now, and Emily looked like a drowned cat in her ruined designer clothes, her makeup completely destroyed and her hair plastered to her skull. She lunged toward me the moment she saw the door open, her voice cracking with a desperate edge that might have been convincing if I hadn't spent months cataloging every one of her deceptions. "Ryan, please, you have to help me," she gasped, reaching for me with hands that were shaking from cold or fear or both. "This is all a misunderstanding. We can explain everything if you just give me a chance." "There's no we here, Emily," I said, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, calm and distant, like I was discussing the weather with a neighbor. "There hasn't been a we for a long time. You made that very clear in your messages. Those were taken out of context. I was venting, I didn't mean any of it. You know how stressful work has been." The thing that struck me most in that moment wasn't her desperation or her fear. It was the fact that she was still lying, still trying to manipulate, still treating me like the harmless nobody she described in her texts. Even now, even with her world in ruins around her, she couldn't bring herself to tell me the truth. Couldn't acknowledge what she'd done without qualifying it, minimizing it, turning it into someone else's fault. Some people never learn, I suppose, never figure out that the lies that got them into trouble aren't going to be the same lies that get them out. I reached behind the door and produced a manila envelope, the kind that feels heavier than its contents should warrant because of everything it represents. "Divorce papers," I said, placing them in her trembling hands, "and a restraining order. You're to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. The house was purchased entirely with my income and inheritance, so you'll be taking your personal belongings and nothing else." Her face twisted into something ugly, the charming mask finally slipping to reveal the person underneath. "You think you can just throw me away after everything I've done for this marriage?" I almost laughed at that, almost let the absurdity of her statement break my composure. But I held on to the cold calm that had gotten me through worse situations than this. "What exactly have you done for this marriage, Emily? Slept with your boss? Stolen money from the company? Called me harmless and a nobody? Plotted to divorce me the moment your bonuses cleared? I shook my head slowly. You didn't treat this marriage like something worth saving. You treated it like a business expense, and now you're discovering that some costs can't be recovered. You're making a mistake, she hissed, and there was genuine venom in her voice now. The last pretense of the loving wife stripped away to reveal something colder underneath. I will destroy you in court. I'll take everything you have. You're welcome to try, I said, and I meant it. But I'd recommend reading those papers carefully before you make any decisions. My attorney has a very comprehensive understanding of your financial situation, including several transactions that the police might find interesting if they haven't already. The fight went out of her then, like watching a balloon deflate, and she slumped against the doorframe with the papers clutched to her chest. The woman standing in front of me looked nothing like the polished executive she'd worked so hard to become, and I realized with something like surprise that I felt almost sorry for her. Not because she didn't deserve what was happening, but because I was watching someone come face to face with the consequences of their own choices and realizing too late that they'd gambled everything on a losing hand. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, and her voice was small now, stripped of everything but fear. That's not my problem anymore, I said, and I closed the door. The click of the lock sounded like the end of a chapter, which I suppose it was. I stood in the foyer of my empty house, listening to the rain and the muffled sounds of Emily's retreat, and I waited for the rush of triumph or vindication, or at least satisfaction to hit me. What I felt instead was a peculiar emptiness, the kind you experience when you've been carrying a heavy weight for so long that putting it down leaves you feeling lighter, but also somehow incomplete. I walked to the living room and poured myself a whiskey, the good stuff that I'd been saving for special occasions, without ever quite deciding what qualified. The first sip burned pleasantly, and I sat in my favorite chair and watched the rain through the windows and let my mind go quiet for the first time in months. There was still a lot to deal with, lawyers and paperwork, and probably months of legal proceedings before everything was settled. But that was future Ryan's problem. Present Ryan had done what needed to be done, and now present Ryan was going to sit in the silence and appreciate the fact that it no longer felt oppressive. The house was different now, or maybe I was different, or maybe it was both. The spaces where Emily had existed were still there, her decorating choices and her preferred arrangement of furniture, but they felt like artifacts from an archaeological dig, evidence of a previous civilization rather than part of a living home. I would change things eventually, make the space my own in ways that I hadn't bothered to do when I was trying to accommodate someone who'd never intended to stay. The following weeks brought a parade of legal proceedings and depositions and the kind of tedious paperwork that makes you appreciate how efficient explosions are by comparison. Emily's attorney tried every trick in the book, painted her as a victim of workplace pressure and a controlling husband, and about 17 other narratives that might have been compelling if there wasn't a mountain of evidence suggesting otherwise. The fraud investigation expanded to include federal charges when they discovered the offshore accounts. And suddenly Emily's legal problems were much bigger than a divorce settlement. I had to testify twice, once for the divorce proceedings and once for the federal investigation, and both times I kept my answers short and factual and refused to be drawn into emotional speculation about my former wife's character or motivations. The lawyers on her side tried to paint me as a vengeful husband who'd manufactured evidence to destroy her, but the forensic accountants had verified everything I'd found, and then some, and by the end of the first week of testimony, even her own legal team seemed to be going through the motions rather than mounting a genuine defense. The hardest part wasn't the legal proceedings or the media attention, or even the occasional hostile encounter with someone who'd been taken in by Emily's victim narrative. The hardest part was the quiet moments, the times when I'd come home to an empty house and reach for the phone to tell someone about my day, before remembering that the person I'd shared that ritual with for nearly a decade was gone. Not dead, just gone. Transformed into a stranger I couldn't recognize and wouldn't want to know even if recognition were possible. Nate Blake took a plea deal that included significant prison time and enough financial penalties to wipe out most of what he'd stolen, and his cooperation agreement meant that Emily couldn't claim ignorance about the depth of the scheme. His wife filed for divorce within the week, and I heard through the corporate grapevine that she'd sold their house in Medina and moved back to her family in Connecticut with the kids. Another casualty of ambition and betrayal, another family broken by people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. I ran into Nate's former wife once, about 6 months after everything happened, in the coffee shop near my office. She recognized me before I recognized her, which made sense because my face had been in the news almost as much as her husband's, and she stopped at my table with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Ryan Coldwell," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Mrs. Blake," I replied, not sure what else to say. "Please call me Catherine. I think we're past formalities at this point." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you mind if I sit for a moment?" We talked for about 20 minutes. Two people whose lives had been demolished by the same bomb, comparing notes on reconstruction. She was doing better than I'd expected, had reconnected with family and old friends, and was slowly building a new life that didn't depend on her husband's approval or his career or his collection of lies. She thanked me, which I hadn't expected, for bringing everything into the open. "It was worse not knowing," she said, stirring a coffee she barely touched. "Suspecting, but never being sure. At least now I understand what I was dealing with." I told her I was glad she was doing well, and I meant it, and after she left, I sat there for a long time thinking about all the people whose lives had intersected with Emily and Nate's scheme, all the collateral damage from two people who'd convinced themselves that the ends justified the means. Harold Moore called me into his office a month after the gala, and I went expecting either a promotion or a conversation about all the confidential information I'd accessed during my investigation. What I got instead was something I hadn't anticipated, a handshake and an offer of partnership in a new security consulting firm he was launching as a subsidiary of North Peak. "You handled this like a professional," he said, his gray eyes assessing me with the same directness he applied to business deals. "No drama, no scandal beyond what was necessary, just clean execution. I could use someone like that on my team." I told him I'd think about it because I needed time to figure out what kind of life I wanted to build now that the old one had been demolished. The money was good and the opportunity was real, but I wasn't sure I wanted to spend the rest of my career uncovering other people's betrayals. There's a cost to that kind of work, a toll it takes on your ability to trust anyone about anything, and I'd paid enough of that toll already. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in April, 6 months after the night I'd first noticed that Emily was texting in bed. The judge had been remarkably efficient once all the financial crimes were factored in, and Emily's attempts to claim half of everything had collapsed under the weight of her own documented statements about planning to leave me. She got nothing except her personal belongings and the debt from her legal fees, and I walked out of that courthouse feeling something I hadn't felt in years. The particular freedom of being unburdened from something you hadn't realized was crushing you. I did take Harold's offer eventually, after a few months of therapy and reflection and figuring out who Ryan Coldwell was supposed to be when he wasn't playing the role of devoted husband to someone who'd never deserved his devotion. The work is challenging and sometimes dark, but it also means that other companies don't get blindsided the way North Peak almost was, that other employees don't lose their careers to schemers and predators, that other families don't get destroyed by people who think they're too smart to get caught. Emily reached out to me once, about a year after everything ended, through an intermediary because the restraining order was still in effect. She wanted to apologize, supposedly, wanted closure or forgiveness or something that would make her feel better about the choices she'd made. I never responded, not because I was still angry. The anger had burned itself out long ago and left behind something quieter and more complicated, but because there was simply nothing left to say. She'd made her choices and I'd made mine, and the consequences had played out exactly as they should have. Revisiting any of it would have been like picking at a scar that had finally started to heal. The last I heard, she was working at a small marketing firm in Arizona, rebuilding her life from scratch with whatever remained of her reputation. Part of me hopes she succeeds, not for her sake particularly, but because people can change and second chances matter, even for people who squandered their first ones spectacularly. But that part is very small and very quiet, and it doesn't keep me up at night the way her betrayal used to. These days I sleep well, The bed doesn't feel empty anymore. It just feels like a bed, a place for rest instead of a battleground. I've started dating again, carefully and slowly, with the kind of attention to red flags that probably makes me seem paranoid, but also keeps me from repeating old mistakes. The woman I'm seeing now is a veterinarian with laugh lines around her eyes and a complete inability to lie convincingly about anything. And sometimes I catch myself being surprised by how easy things can be when both people are actually trying. The house has changed too. New furniture and new paint, and enough differences that it doesn't feel like a museum dedicated to my failed marriage anymore. I kept a few things, practical items that were mine before Emily and remained mine after her. But most of what we'd accumulated together is gone, donated or sold, or simply thrown away. Starting over at 41 isn't what I'd planned for my life. But then again, very little about the past year has gone according to plan, and I've learned to be okay with that. Sometimes I think about that night in the ballroom, the moment when everything changed, and I try to identify exactly what I was feeling as I watched Emily's world collapse around her. The truth is, I don't remember triumph or vengeance, or even particularly strong satisfaction. What I remember is exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of finally being done with a battle I'd never wanted to fight in the first place. She'd turned our marriage into a war, and I'd won, but winning felt less like victory and more like surviving, like walking away from a wreck you hadn't been driving. The point of telling this story isn't to make myself look good or to paint Emily as a monster, though she certainly wasn't the hero of our particular narrative. The point is that people show you who they are in small ways long before they show you in big ones. And the real failure of my marriage wasn't the affair or the fraud or even the betrayal at the gala. The real failure was years of small dismissals and subtle disrespects that I chose to ignore, because admitting their significance would have meant admitting that something was fundamentally wrong. By the time she started calling me harmless in text to her lover, she'd been treating me as harmless for years, and I'd let her because it was easier than confronting a truth I wasn't ready to face. That's the lesson I carry with me now, into this new chapter of my life, with its new possibilities and its hard-won clarity. Pay attention to the small things. Trust your instincts when they tell you something is wrong, and never ever let someone convince you that your peace of mind is less important than their comfort. The rain is falling again tonight, the same Seattle rain that's been falling for as long as anyone can remember, and I'm sitting in my living room with a glass of whiskey and absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. The silence in this house isn't empty anymore. It's just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, and everything that needed to be washed away is finally gone. Tomorrow there will be work and challenges and all the complications of living a real life in a world that doesn't particularly care about your comfort. But tonight, right now, there's just this: a man in his own space, at peace with his choices, looking forward to whatever comes next without fear or obligation or the weight of someone else's deceptions. And honestly, after everything that happened, that's more than enough.